All right, the classical era. What does that mean? Well, the term classical is often used to describe uh, most instrumental music, regardless of the time period when it was crafted. This is a common mistake. Musically speaking, correct usage of that term classical applies to a compositional style that occurs from roughly the year 1750 through the 1820s ish. Um, there was this new music that evolved out of the previous era's tradition, the Baroque era, um, but it could not sound more different. To understand why there's such a big shift in these musics, we have to go to a movement known as the Enlightenment, which the center of that is in Vienna, Austria. Uh, the Enlightenment. So the what is the Enlightenment? It was an intellectual movement rooted in scientific, economic, and social progress. Wars, agricultural improvements, manufacturing, and trade contributed to economic growth in the 18th century in Europe and created something that we recognize as the middle class. As the economy thrived for the growing middle class, so did a new concept that we recognize to be leisure time. The middle class demanded education and entertainment, while churches, courts, and city governments had been a fairly inclusive sponsor of entertainment for the wealthy. And innovation created opportunities for all to experience the power of the arts. This innovation was called the public concert. Concerts attended during leisure time contributed to a rise in what we call amateur musicianship. So concerts mean amateur musicianship. What do we say when we mean amateur musicianship? Well, not professional musicians. Amateur musicians required music that you, the layman, could play and understand. Music publishers recognized this need and attempted to cater specifically to it. Keyboard music, chamber music, and solo music, as well as choral vocal music, were produced for the amateur musicians' home entertainment. Vienna, perhaps, is the first music city. This is the center of enlightened countries. Viennese music publishers sought composers that were writing music accessible for amateur musicians. Two stars that fit this bill are Franz Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. They were a perfect fit for what the music publishers were looking for. They were drawn to Vienna's music scene and became synonymous with the music's quote unquote classical style. Classical style has two parts. The first part is phrasing, and the second is form. We're going to kind of compare the classical style versus the previously existing mold, the Baroque era. You're going to find out that if you went to sing along with these examples, one of them would be significantly easier to sing. The first example of comparison, so we could really hear this dramatic change, comes from a Baroque era aria, Baroque era vocal music. There is one word that the singer sings in Italian in which they will sustain one single vowel sound over the course of more than 70 different notes. It's quite a workout there. In case I run into any copyright infringements, I'm going to, and these audio recordings get lost somewhere. The example title, I will type them as we are listening to them. Let me make sure that we can hear some stuff. So, jump out of this for a second and jump into, go back. Hopefully this will work for us. All right, that's we heard quite three examples of that sustained one note, not one note, one syllable get drawn out for over the course of many different pitches. So the first one that we encountered was over 70. The subsequent ones were not 70 different notes for that one syllable. Really hard to sing along with, not very predictable, just kind of showcasing vocal virtuosity. The classical era, by comparison, is going to be much more sing-alongable with technical terms. This comes from Don Giovanni, to opera by Mozart. And as we listen here, just the melodies themselves and then what the singer actually sings, you go, wow, I could probably imitate that pretty easily. So here's a little bit of that.
Piova e vento sopportar, mangiar male, mal dormir. Voglio fare il gentiluomo e non voglio più servir, e non voglio più servir, no, non voglio più servir. Oh, che caro galantuomo, puoi star dentro con la bella ed io far la sentinella, la sentinella, la sentinella. E voglio fare il gentiluomo e non voglio più servire, no, non voglio più servire, no, 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 non voglio più servire. Mi pare che venga gente, non mi pare che venga gente, non mi voglio far sentire, non mi voglio far sentire, non mi voglio far sentire, no, 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 non mi voglio far sentire.
All right, we'll pause that there. Much easier to sing along with that one. With the nope, 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 no. He's literally singing the word no. It's a comedy. the Don Giovanni. We'll talk about musical comedy a little bit later, but let's get back into, now that we've kind of A-B'd a Baroque era aria and a classical era aria, let's talk about why these things sound so different. We talk about phrasing. There are two kinds of phrasings. One would be melodic phrasing, and the other would be harmonic phrasing. Composers of the Baroque era tended to compose melodies that would be considered instrumentally conceived. Melodies from the classical era, on the other hand, are what we would consider to be vocally conceived melodies. Singable might be an easier way to think of the music from the classical era. Of course, vocal music is singable in any era, but we are concerned with amateurs being able to sing and also play the music. The ease of executing these melodies becomes prominent when comparing both vocal music and instrumental music of this era, specifically melodies, when we compare melodies from different eras. Singable melodies as a trend go beyond music for accompanied voice. I'm going to play a little bit of music from a Baroque era concerto, and then we are going to try and sing along with it, and then we're going to listen to a classical era concerto and try and sing along with that. Again, it is likely that you'll find these to be much easier from the classical era, but I don't want any spoilers other than I just spoiled it myself. So here's a Baroque era concerto by Bach. Wow, it took like a minute and 15 seconds before there, for me, felt like there was a spot that you could breathe within that music. The melody is just so long-winded. Actually, the first like 20 seconds or so of that melody, he tried to sing that. I will poorly demonstrate for us. Sing over the recording. And then I'm out of breath and the music is still going on. The dig-a-dig-a-doo version of Bach. Let's compare that particular melody with from another classical era composer, Haydn, who wrote a concerto for trumpet. Here's a little bit of the trumpet concerto. pause that there. If you're keeping in mind that we want to be able to try and sing back the melody, already you should kind of say, well, one of them is a little easier on the ears, but I'm just going to back this up to where the trumpet of the trumpet concerto enters, and do some singing along in the dig-a-dig-a-doo style that I did for the Bach example. Just in like 10 seconds alone there, me singing over the recording, not the greatest, but kind of singing along with what's happening there. I have a lot more sustained passages. It's not as notey. There is some call and response between the trumpet and the orchestra, which is fine, but I chose to sing along with the trumpet parts, as that to me kind of rings as the main melody. And like, I could breathe for days and days and days. Each one of those little melodies had or that whole larger four melody was broken up into singable phrases, which is a big shift that we see when we get to the classical era. So that's just the tip of the iceberg on melodic phrasing. Two different examples. We're going to continue to A-B these things, but let's kind of talk about harmonic phrasing, which goes hand in hand with melody. It kind of accompanies the melody. Composers had been using harmony for several hundreds of years, but the idea of something that we call a cadence, or a harmonic cadence, didn't really appear until the Baroque era. A cadence occurs at the end of a musical phrase, be it a melodic phrase or a harmonic phrase. Composers of the classical era made the endings of musical phrases very clear to the listener, especially when compared to their predecessors. So a cadence, I'm going to demonstrate on the piano I have hooked up real quick, is we have a little musical passage. We had four chords that happened, 1, 2, 3, and 4. After the third chord, there was like this little tension that happened on the way to the fourth chord that probably signaled to your ears that we're near the end and we need to go back to that fourth chord, which was actually the first chord that I played, in order to kind of really create a complete thought. Let me play it one more time. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We would think of that as like a musical sentence that's a statement, kind of ends with a period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Now, if I wanted to end us with a musical question mark, perhaps in this sentence, I would just leave us hanging out maybe on the third chord and not give you that fourth chord back. Check it out. That might bug you a little bit that I did not finish and go back to where I started. That type of cadence, again, is kind of like the equivalent of a musical question mark, in that we expect something more to happen, some sort of musical response is necessary. You wouldn't say like, that's the end of my song right there. The first one that I played for you, the one that sounded more like a sentence, we end up calling that like an authentic, or what would be another word that we use? Maybe like a closed cadence, like it is the end of the road. The first one, complete thought. Second one we call like an open cadence or a half cadence. The musicians often use authentic and half as their terminology that they roll with, more than open and closed. But some textbooks and things will utilize open and closed. I don't like those words. Just know that they exist. There's a third type of cadence, which brings me a whole bunch of joy when I play them. Usually you hear these at the end of a song but they leave you with like there needs to be a little bit more. It's not quite as tension-inducing as the half cadence, but it's not a perfect resolution like the authentic cadence. It's called a deceptive cadence because we get a hybrid of these two ideas. In one sense, the completed thought is the melody. We get this, but the incomplete thought will be in the harmony. So this is a deceptive cadence coming to you. So that's somewhere in the middle of these two ideas, where you have the melodies like a complete thought, but the harmony is not quite a complete thought. We call that deceptive. Usually you expect a little bit more to follow after that. Like it does, like a half cadence, need more, but it doesn't leave you with that irksome feeling of, please get me out of here. Deceptive, half, authentic would be combination of three ideas, just with chords, with harmonies that we use to create tension, or complete a resolution based on reoccurring tension. So to hear this kind of in context with a more appropriate melody, we're going to go check out some overtures. We're going to do a Baroque era overture versus a classical era overture. The Baroque overture, you're going to find that it's hard to tell where the ends of the musical phrases are. It just kind of keeps going. Here, check it out. This is a Handel example from Julius Caesar. For me, in that example, it took about a minute and 20 seconds before we got to what was clearly a different section of the music. But like every time we got to the end of what felt like a melodic phrase, the harmonies didn't like really sell it to me that was the end of that thought. It felt like it wanted to keep meandering and keep going, versus a classical era overture, which comes from Mozart. This is the Marriage of Figaro. pause that there. After about a minute of hearing the Marriage of Figaro, you might note like, wow, that was really notey. A lot of short notes that are all smushed together in rapid succession. But even though there were a lot of notes per se in the melody, they're all followed by room to breathe. So like just the very opening, like even as I sing that, there's a little pause in there. Versus, just go back to the Julius Caesar thing from Handel real quick. This particular recording left some room for breaths, but it's still not very clear to me where all the breaths are. And different recordings will place different breaths in different places. I'll let it go a little bit longer. I mean, if you really dig in, yes, of course there are breaths within the phrasing there, but just the harmonies, they just move and don't ever like let up. I think that by comparison to the classical era, just one is easier to digest than the other. Not knocking the Baroque era, but just observing that one is a little bit easier to see. It's like, bam, that's this. You can identify it. One more example with this phrasing idea. We're going to turn to keyboard music, and we will check out some Johann Sebastian Bach. If you checked out the Baroque era lecture, you probably heard a little bit of this example. Check out, this is really short, the Invention number 4 in D minor from Bach. Holy moly, barrage of notes. And when we talk about like a harmonic cadence, say at the end of that piece is really where we get a harmonic cadence. You finally sells that, hey, that's the authentic cadence at the end. But like the whole journey that you go through along the way is like, was that the end of a section? Was that the end of a phrase? When you dive into that music and you learn how to play it, you find little isms. But as a listener that's not going to learn how to play it, it's very overwhelming. So let's compare it to a Mozart example from the classical era. This is a fairly ubiquitous piece called Rondo alla Turca. So the end of each of these phrases in short little 30 seconds is like so clear cut and dry for me by comparison. It's like there is no question as to where are the phrases? Bigga-digga-dum, bigga-digga-dum, bigga-digga-digga-digga-digga-dum, ba-ba-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. Like you could hear even in the short little phrases within the one larger phrase, it's hanging out on that harmony. Bigga-digga-dum, bigga-digga-dum, bigga-digga-digga-digga-dum, ba-ba-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum-bum. Probably played a couple wrong chords in there, but the end of that is so cut and dry. It's like such a night and day difference between the classical era and the what are we comparing it to? The Baroque era. Going to add a note about the difference between the phrasing being a little more singable versus less singable. Hopefully that little note makes a little sense for you that I added over here. Okay, let's move on to the idea of form, which is the other half of the classical style. Form, if you recall from the Elements of Music lecture, is the order of musical events, the when we are in a piece of music. So if you have not listened to a great deal of instrumental music, you may be a little more familiar with terms like verse, chorus, and bridge. But these words only really work if we're dealing with music with lyrical content. So when we have no words, we have to come up, no sung words rather, we have to come up with a new system that helps us identify what it is that we're hearing. Baroque era treatments of instrumental music and procedures tends to lack a certain amount of predictability. By contrast, in the classical era, the procedures used are a lot more digestible. We're going to turn our attention to a couple concepts. One is called theme and variations. Another is called the minuet and trio. And the final one is going to be called the sonata form. If I can type. There we go. Sonata form. All right. The simplest of these labels for procedures that we are commonly encountering during the classical era, theme and variations, is very straightforward. You take a musical theme and then you create subsequent variations on this theme. For example, if we were, say, looking at a timeline, here's a timeline with the start being on the left and the end being on the right. The beginning of this little piece that we're going to listen to, think of this maybe as a progress bar on a playback of a song that you're listening to on a device of your choosing. You get to watch the little thing scroll from one side to the other. The beginning chunk of our example would probably be maybe a short little introduction, but then we get the theme, some sort of well-known ubiquitous melody. Then as we get to the conclusion, final statement of that theme, we proceed to have a slightly spiced up version of that melody. Maybe it's got more notes added to it. Maybe the harmony's been changed. Basically, you can take any of the elements of music and alter just one of them to create something different from your original theme. Then if you're a clever composer, you'll continue to create more subsequent variations until you get to the end of your piece and you have, say, 1, 2, 3, 4 variations and a little ending that we would call a coda. So composers would take typically a like well-known folk song or nursery rhyme and then follow this kind of roadmap that I've drawn for you. The main point of this roadmap, compositionally anyway, was that you could recognize the theme in each variation, even though it was being presented to you in a new way. So we have a little example for us from Haydn. Haydn wrote a bunch of symphonies in his lifetime. This one is dubbed the Surprise Symphony. It begins with the theme, and then it is followed by 4 variations before we get to a little coda at the end. So let's listen to all of this, and if your sound is not cranked, you might want to do that. It gets a little soft in the beginning here of the initial statement of the theme. Okay. That marks the end of the theme section. If you didn't get it ingrained in your head yet, it's like wiki. Bum 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 bum, and scares the crap out of everybody. Comedian that Haydn was. That one's dubbed the Surprise Symphony, if I didn't say that earlier. And that's the musical surprise for you. So that's the theme. Then he follows this theme with a variation. So this is the first variation on that theme. And as you're listening, you should still be able to hear the strings playing that melody that I just played a little tidbit of on the piano. But he added this bowed string thing that's a little bit higher and some woodwinds that play a little counter melody. So not too much different from the theme, just a slight little added descant in the higher ranged instruments, and it's all still soft and delicate. So you might describe that first variation as containing those things that set it apart from the theme. Second variation's a little bit different. Here comes variation 2. Okay, so that was the third I'm sorry, the second variation, and we probably noticed some dynamic contrast, some volume contrast there. New texture, we had brass show up, some minor thoughts instead of major, quite a bit of variation in that second variation. Now we go to variation number 3. So, right before we get into the final variation on the theme, that particular one had double articulation for each of the notes in the theme. So we had more notes for the theme instead of bum, 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 bum. You get bum, 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 bum. And it goes back to being soft there. Now the final variation is going to be loud and exciting and a couple other things. Here comes the fourth variation. So the fourth variation has kind of come to an end, and the big tail end of everything, the coda, helps us know that the end is near, and he's going to have a big finish with little bits, not a formal statement of the theme one more time. So not a true variation, just a big ending. So here comes the big ending. Deceptive cadence. Ah, lovely. So that's how a theme and variation works. We typically expect to see a theme and variation in a lot of classical era multi-movement works. You might see me abbreviating in the listening examples MVT at the end of a lot of these various examples. That's short for movement. A lot of times in all this instrumental stuff, we break one larger piece up into smaller chapters, if you will, and we call those chapters movements. Typically, composers started to get into a little pattern of like what you could expect for a procedure to happen within each of these different movements. And a theme and variations usually is found in movement 2 of a multi-movement work. Usually the slower movement presents a lot of opportunity for the composer to get playful with a singular theme, whether they've written it or it's someone else's theme. But more on that a little bit later when we talk about the different types of genres of music that you could experience during the classical era. Let's move on to minuet and trio as a form. What this means is that there are two contrasting sections. That's it. You have an A idea and a B idea. They're supposed to sound rather different from each other, like maybe the A idea has lots of short notes and a very angular melody, meaning a lot of jumps in it, while the B section would want to contrast that and maybe be in a different mode. Maybe instead of the A theme's minor, the B theme is in major. It's got a lot of long notes. It's got a very linear melody, not a lot of jumps in the melody. And the timeline, if we're looking at the timeline that I've kind of drawn here, is only 4 divisions long. The first division would be what we would call the minuet section, or that A idea. It's the first thing that we hear, unless there's a very short intro in front of it. We'd have like A ideas, minuet. Then, just so you, the listener, get it stuck in your head, we're going to repeat that most of the time. So literally copy and paste the information. You hear it twice. So minuet, minuet. Then we break up this repetition with a contrasting longer section called the trio, or the B idea. It's something that should sound totally different, especially after you've heard it twice. And then we're going to end everything with one more statement of the minuet. You might think of this as A, B, A, or minuet, minuet, trio, minuet. And for short, we call this whole procedure minuet and trio. We're going to listen to the third movement of Haydn's 94th Symphony. So immediately what would happen after the surprise, in the Surprise Symphony, movement 2, what we just listened to, is we get movement 3. So here comes movement 3. Let's see if we can pick out the A idea. So I'm noticing right now that after that little soft section with the ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, it went right back to how the recording kicked off, which means that we completed a cycle in the minuet, and now we're repeating the minuet. Sounded familiar to me. That was the first thing that we heard. I went, oh yeah, I've heard that before. So now we are in the cycle 2 of minuet. I lied. There was a little bit of a codetta, a tiny coda, on the back end of that idea. Now we're getting actual minuet, minuet number 2. Now, this material that we're hearing after that big bomb, that that kind of marked, hey, this is the end of a section. That was a little cadence, tiny cadence for us. Now we're in the trio, the contrasting section, different melodies now, different harmonies. And then we get that melody that we've heard now twice before in the minuet section. So that signals to me, the knowledgeable listener, that we have ended the trio section. We have returned to the final statement, the final minuet. So we've gone A, A, B, A, if you want to think in shorter terms there. All right. So you're listening to probably some of the longest examples of instrumental music that you've consciously listened to at this point. Good for you. Hopefully, kind of breaking them down helps them. At least you can maybe digest the timeline of these things and understand what it is that you're actually listening for when you're listening to this instrumental music. So let's move on from the minuet and trio to another favored procedure. Oh, by the way, the minuet and trio, again, would often occur as a procedure as the third movement of a multi-movement work. And oftentimes the composers thought that they were clever and constructing these in 3-beat meters, the minuets and trios, and having them as the third movement, lots of threes. Anyway, moving on to the sonata procedure, sonata form. It's the most complicated one because it has two principal major themes. Now, not necessarily in a major key. These themes appear in 3 contrasting sections on our giant timeline. In some instances, there's no middle section at all, and it's just the beginning part and the end part. In other instances, we had more repetitions of themes of those initial principal themes, and the naming system gets very complicated, and people have written lots of books on the different types of sonata forms that exist. We're going to stick with the most common. Some scholars will call it a type 3 sonata form. This is where we get presented 2 themes during our first section, which we'll call the exposition. We shall name these themes theme number 1 and theme number 2. So creative. The first theme gets stated. It's usually followed by a very slight variation on the theme that functions as some sort of transition material that takes us to the second theme, or theme number 2. Sometimes composers make it blatantly obvious when the first theme concludes and the second theme shall begin. They utilize cadences and or silence. Following the second theme, we should have a big sonic contrast between theme 1 and theme 2 to really drive home that they are two different themes. There's often a little tiny coda, a codetta, that rounds out this whole first section with all these things that I just described, called the exposition. The exposition is usually repeated just like in the minuet, where you get to hear it twice. You get to hear the exposition twice to make sure that you, the listener, had a chance to grab onto all of the musical characters that are present here, theme 1 and theme 2. The most intriguing portion of the sonata form is the middle section, the development section, because anything goes here. The composer ventures outside of the box and they create anything that they want, variations on either or both of the themes, possibly simultaneously. They can use a number of compositional techniques like fragmentation or augmentation, change the key from major to minor, change up the instrumentation, maybe have some imitation, anything goes. A little extra clarification on fragmentation or augmentation. If we take, say, a little melody like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, if I was going to use only a fragment of that, maybe I use, and then I can move that around anywhere I want. Hearing it several times like that, you're just taking a fragment of the whole larger theme and using it. Versus, say, augmentation, which would be augmenting individual or many note values along the way. So instead of hearing bum, 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 we hear could be an augmented idea while there's some contrasting material present. Changing the tonality from major to minor. You ever hear Twinkle Twinkle in minor? Sadness. You could change the instrument. You could change the range where you hear it. So when I played it from mid-range to higher range or down in low range, anything goes. Composers get to kind of show off their knowledge set of different compositional musical construction techniques. So after that whole section that I was just talking about was the development section, where you take two of your themes and go nuts with them. Then finally we get to the recapitulation, the final section. Following all that chaos in the development section, we are given familiar material. Recapitulation has the word recap in it. During this recap, we hear theme 1 in its entirety as it was played during the exposition. There might be a little bit extra added to it. The transition, the little variation on it that kind of follows might be embellished a little bit more, grabbing little pieces of the development section that we heard. But then it is usually followed by the same sort of treatment that we heard in the exposition to let us know that, hey, this is the end of everything that's happening with theme 1. And we get to theme 2, and we hear this big old contrast where we're expecting to hear theme number 2. But this time, theme number 2 is not going to be as we heard it in the exposition. It's going to sound a little more continuative with theme 1. So, for example, in the exposition, if we heard theme 1 was minor and theme 2 was major, this time in the recap, they'll both probably be in a minor key. Kind of creates a little more continuity and lets us have a nice little ending, maybe a little coda after that, just to put a bow on it and call it a day. Very complicated procedure just to grab out of nowhere, but if you're thinking of this from the perspective of what you're listening for, these are all the things that you're literally listening for. You didn't know this before I told you all these things. So hopefully it makes sense. Anyway, we're going to check out my favorite example of sonata form, which comes from Mozart's 40th Symphony, the first movement. And if you want to like get theme 1 stuck in your head real quick, I had a teacher tell me one time that you can make up little words to this theme, and the ones that his teacher had made up, or he made up, was it's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart. And you just keep saying that over and over and over again. It works with the melody. So here's it's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart for theme number 1. Theme 2 doesn't have words. It's a plane, it's a Mozart. Get it? That's the theme. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart. It's the kind of rhythmic pattern that happens over and over again. Now we're going to hear like kind of a little repetition variation on that, and it's going to be followed by a big old silence, and then we get theme 2. I'll do a little shouting over the recording to ruin it for us. Silence, theme 2. Here comes little Codetta. Over 16-1. Fragments of theme 1 would be the better description. Exposition round 2. Theme 1, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart. Repeated variation on theme 1. Transitory material. Oh, that was the silence. Now we're into theme 2. Sorry, I forgot to announce. So it's in the music. Here's the little Codetta. This section, and then we're diving into the development. Ah, it's theme one, but it's different in sequence. And fragmented. All this is very unfamiliar and new, and we're transitioning our way out of the development into familiar material. Ah, there's good old theme one from the exposition, but now we're in the recap, where it's going to be slightly different when we get to the transition material that follows this cadence. Silence new theme two. So theme two is similar, except something's a little tweaked now. We went from major the first two times we heard theme two to this transformed version, which is now in minor. With a little bit extra. And the little coda, codetta. Maybe this section is better called the big coda. Really lets us know that it's over. So that's only the first movement of Mozart's 40th Symphony. A lot of fun. Great example of sonata form, and hopefully you now have It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's a Mozart ingrained in your being forever and ever. We're going to move right along to another idea that's present, part of this classical style discussion, which would be the various genres that we come across in the classical era. How the phrasing and form blend together is the challenging part when we're talking about understanding instrumental music. The easy part is knowing where and how it's used. So during the classical era, large-scale, long works were all the rage. The works are broken up into 3 or 4 still long sections called movements that we do not clap between in live performance. And each of these movements utilizes a single form, unlike Bach, who usually combined back-to-back forms like Passacaglia and Fugue was all part of one little section. That was a very long section. These large-scale works could be performed by ensembles as small as one person and as large as an orchestra. And we're going to refer to these as genres. Aside from very few exceptions, the vast majority of symphonies were composed for orchestra. Composers like Haydn and Mozart, who steal the show when we discuss the classical era, I think every example we used from the classical era was by one of them. They favored the orchestra when it came for symphonic writing or writing symphonies. Mozart composed 41 symphonies, while Haydn composed an impressive 104 symphonies. Mozart did die a lot younger than Haydn did, though. Each of the examples from the form discussion were movements from various symphonies, as you see labeled here. Concerti, multiple concertos, during this era tended to abandon the idea of having many featured soloists. Oops, I have a typo that I just noticed over yonder in our listening example. Concerto. So when we listened to the Baroque versus classical Brandenburg Concerto versus the Haydn Trumpet Concerto, the Brandenburg Concerto features many soloists. In the classical concerto, the trumpet concerto, we have one soloist that's backed by an orchestra. Both of these ideas involve soloists being backed by orchestras. In the classical era, we just whittled it down to one. And most of the time, I picked the trumpet concerto because it's one of the rare exceptions here, but most of the classical era concerti feature the new instrument of the era, which was the piano got invented. And we hear that all over the place being used as the soloist instrument being backed by the orchestra. Everybody was digging the sound of the piano, and the harpsichord kind of went out of style. The piano took over. So here are just a few seconds of Mozart's 20th piano concerto, which has a moment of improvisation in it for the performer. We call this piano improvised solo, though any instrument can perform this improvised solo in this style, a cadenza. Here's just a little bit of what this texture of a piano concerto would sound like. So we hear string orchestra, woodwinds. And then everything drops away and all we hear is the piano for a little bit. And then we get the fusion of all of it together. Lots of sonic colors there. This particular example is probably utilizing sonata form, and like theme 1 may have been executed at least in the first pass through the exposition. Side note, we would have heard the orchestra play everything, play all of the themes that we're about to hear in the piano concerto. But then when we get to the second pass through the exposition, the piano usually takes theme 1 and then is joined a little bit later by the orchestra. And when we get to the usually either the end of the exposition or the end of the recapitulation, we get a moment to really showcase the piano player, the soloist, and give them that cadenza that I spoke of. Okay, that was just for color. There we get to hear different colors of the orchestra. Now, another genre is a chamber group that's smaller than an orchestra, but more than a soloist. The title chamber is a reference to the space in which a group would fit to perform. The most popular chamber ensemble is a string quartet, very popular during the classical era. There are, you guessed it, 4 stringed instruments in that group, 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello. There's no upright bass in a string quartet. A string quartet sounds just like this. Whoop. Just like this. This recording has a harpsichord that I didn't hear when I played it through my speakers, but in my headphones, I hear a harpsichord. So this is not a true string quartet. But if we were to hear that piece performed by those 4 instruments that I previously listed, that would in fact be a string quartet. One more genre to talk about, which is called the sonata, not to be confused with sonata form. This is a multi-movement piece for typically a soloist. In very rare cases, there's like one extra player, like maybe a clarinet player and a piano player do a clarinet sonata. The sonata's multi-movement work utilizes these common procedures that we spent a lot of time talking about. The piano sonata is probably the most common one. So it's just straight up piano. Here's a little bit of Mozart's 11th piano sonata. That Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the alleged string quartet piece there that had the harpsichord, that was also a Mozart example. So here's, again, just a little bit of piano sonata, the Rondo alla Turca one more time. So only one instrument there, just the piano in a piano sonata versus the string quartet, supposed to be 4 stringed instruments, a concerto, a big orchestra with a featured soloist, or a symphony, which is the whole orchestra, no one designated soloist. All of these things are genres that employ usage of these procedures that we spent the last good while talking about, the forms. Okay, one more puzzle piece to talk about during the classical era. Most of what we talked about was instrumental music and being innovative. We did have 2 previous, earlier in the discussion, vocal music examples, and that's where our last item lies, is with vocal music. The days of the castrati and the Baroque era aria are done. We have a new innovation that is musical comedy. Deep-voiced male singer. He's the clown of the show. Usually we call him the buffoon. Opera buffa is the opposite of opera seria, comedic opera versus serious opera. In the age of the Enlightenment, people that went to the opera liked to laugh, and we needed this character. We found over time that this character was necessary to storytelling of opera. Usually a baritone or bass singer that delivers comedic lines of dialogue, he's going to have to sing them if it's an opera. So he's going to sing these comedic lines of dialogue. The funny male characters often stole the show. And just a little context for what I am about to play for us. You probably don't speak Italian. If you could find a video performance of this particular piece, it will be that much more joyous for you. I'll type out the descriptor, or I'm sorry, the title of this little excerpt for you as I start to play the audio for it. It's from Mozart's Don Giovanni, again. which is in Italian, even though Mozart was a German speaker. Italian was the superior choice for melismatic singing over Germanic singing, especially if you were going to write an opera. The story of Don Giovanni is the tale of Don Juan, who's an anti-hero. That means he's a bad guy that you're rooting for. And he's an adventurer, but by 21st century standards, we don't condone his behavior. He's not a good dude. He is famous for his sexual conquests all over Europe. He had over 2,000 of them. In Mozart's dark comedy, the show is stolen not by the title character Don Giovanni, but by his sidekick, Leporello. In Leporello's most memorable aria, he explains in great detail all of Don Giovanni's documented conquests to one of Don Giovanni's sexual conquests. The name of this aria is the catalog aria, and the X, of course, is in the catalog. With the video, this is really wonderful, but we don't have that technology. So here is the audio of Leporello explaining the various conquests here.
Adamina, il catalogo è questo, e le belle che amo il padron mio, un catalogo è che ho fatto io. Osservate, leggete con me, osservate, leggete con me. In Italia 640, in Lavagna 231, 100 in Francia, in Turchia 91, ma in Spagna son già 1.300. 1.300.
So this first little passage here, if you have the basic understanding of, say, like Spanish or even Italian, some Latin root words that you may have understood there, was he is explaining in the numbers of women that Don Giovanni has slept with in various countries. And the very last one that he repeats a few times, 1.300, that's in Spain, in España, he has been with 1,003 women is the translation there. Go check out, just if you're going to check out anything, check out this one scene from Don Giovanni. Worth your time. That is a wrap for all of the items in the classical era to be breezed over here. We could have gone much further, of course, into detail and talked about the livelihoods of composers like Mozart and Haydn and even young Beethoven. But Beethoven's going to be the star of the show in the next video lecture that will appear, which will be the Romantic era. He kind of is the transitory composer to kick us over into a new time period. So here ends the story of the classical era.